Good morning. I hope that I find you ready to study the Bible, but maybe you're curious about how you could do it more effectively or in a way that you understand it a little bit more without having to do some of these Christian study guides that don't necessarily focus on Bible study, but focus more on how to live and how to interpret the Bible. And I found that as a Christian my whole life, there was a lot more of these the Christian studies that were telling me how to interpret the Bible as opposed to people telling me how to actually study the Bible myself. So I decided to go out and look for this answer myself. And then over the last couple of years, I've followed a lot of people's advice and then also come up with some ideas on my own about some fundamental things that I think that people should know whether they've been a Christian their life long or just discovered their faith and are ready to start studying the Bible. I wanted people to learn how to actually read it so that they would be interested in doing it all the time. And that includes the whole Bible, not just the New Testament, not just verses here and there, but like the whole Bible. So I hope that you watch to the end, because this is going to be how to do that and where to start. So first and foremost, it's really important to understand that the Bible is one big story. It's a bunch of little stories, but it's all one big story. And it starts at the very beginning and it ends with the prophecy of the end, of the beginning of the new earth, of new heaven and earth. But it's first the story of the nation of Israel and the Hebrew nation. And then when Christ came, the first part of the story, the Old Testament, is the story about the nation, the history of Israel and the God of Israel. And it all points to the coming of Christ and the coming Messiah that happened in the New Testament. So it's all one big story about the nation of Israel and the God of Israel and the Israelite people and the Hebrew Israelite people, and then how everyone in the world became a part of that family of the God of Israel. So that's important to understand, because growing up as a little kid, I didn't understand how the stories all connected with one another. And I would hear individual stories here and there, but I didn't understand how it all connected to that. And so that's the first piece of fundamental information about the Bible that I can tell you. The second is that if you are going to structure your understanding on the Bible, there are 4 covenants that God makes that you can structure the entire Bible on top of. The first covenant, and covenants are just the promise that God says, I promise I'm going to do this, and then he follows through on that promise. So these covenants are either with people, they're with people or they're with nations, but these are promises that God makes, and he has fulfilled them, or will fulfill them in the future when he made them, and then has fulfilled them. We know he moved forward and fulfilled them now. So the first is the Abrahamic covenant, and that is the covenant that he makes with Abraham in the book of Genesis. And at this time, we have to remember that there was no nation of Israel. There were only Hebrew people, and Abraham was a descendant of Adam. And as we go through the book of Genesis to the book of Abraham, it shows you the progression of Adam. Then it shows you the progression down to Noah. Then it shows the progression of Noah and his sons down to Abraham. So everything that happens before Abraham, the Bible actually lays out how we get to Abraham. And it also shows where the nations of when God destroyed the earth with the flood, there was 3 sons of Noah. All 3 of those sons, and Shem is one of them. Shem is where the nation of Israel comes from. While all of them are related, it shows how all of them disperse into the world and what different groups they form into the world, which is really interesting. And I'm not going to go into that detail today, but if you ever wanted to know like how did the Egyptian nation form? How did where they settled, where they settled into Greece, where they settled into Asia, like all those things it shows that, and you can do a whole study just on that, which is really fascinating. But Abraham is a descendant of Shem, and then Abraham is, God tells Abraham that when he's not, remember he's old, he was, him and his wife Sarah had no children, and they were, he was 100 years old, and so was she, basically. And so he says, I'm going to make all nations, you're going to have descendants that will number the stars, and all nations will come through your line to me. And so, of course, Abraham was like, what? And he ends up fulfilling that covenant. He ends up giving Sarah a son, and Sarah ends up leading to the nation of Israel through Abraham. So the covenant with Abraham that God made was unconditional. God is going to fulfill that covenant regardless of what Abraham did. There was no promise that Abraham had to make in return and say, and God didn't say, your descendants will outnumber the stars if you do da 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 da. He said, this is what I'm going to do. So Abraham was the beginning. And if you look at even now, we call Muslim, Jewish, and Christian beliefs Abrahamic beliefs, because all three of those groups of people believe in the God of Israel as the ultimate God of the world. So now how they dispersed after that is a different story, but all of them believe in the God of Israel. And so that's why we call them Abrahamic religions. And if you think about the Muslim, Jewish, and Christian faiths throughout the world, they're everywhere. So that's where the covenant comes from. So there's that covenant, and we have to always go back to these covenants when we're reading things in the Bible, because even in the New Testament, they will reference back to these things. And so that's why it's important to understand what they are. The next covenant is going to be the one that God made with the nation of Israel. Now, this was after Moses led them out of Egypt, and they were in slavery in Egypt for 400 years. And then God goes and gives them the law, and he gives Moses the law, and he says, you are going to be my people, and I will be your God, as long as you follow the law that I give you. I'm going to drink from my little, don't get your tinsel in a tangle cup, because it's not quite Christmas season yet, but I have put out some Christmas stuff. So the covenant with the nation of Israel was conditional. This is important because it was conditional on the nation of Israel following through on their end of the bargain. And if you read through the book of Exodus where the law was given, and then you read further into Leviticus and Deuteronomy, we'll discuss that in a second, you'll understand that God says, I'll do this for you. And if you do follow my law, I will bless you. I will bless you. You will win the battles that you're in. Like, everything will happen the way that it's supposed to. But if you don't follow my law, you will be cursed. And these are all the things that will happen if you don't follow my law. So, and as you'll remember, as soon as Moses got the law, and the nation of Israel, all the tribes of Israel said, yes, we agree, we will do this. We agree to your terms. They immediately start building the golden calf and worshiping it when the first commandment says that you're not supposed to have any gods before him. So that story right there starts how the nation of Israel rose and fell constantly between doing what God wanted them to do and then not doing what God wanted them to do, doing what God wanted them to do, then rebelling, then following the law for a little bit, then not following the law for a little bit. And that starts the cycle. And it starts in the book of Exodus, and it ends when Christ comes and fulfills the law of Moses, which we'll talk about the Messianic covenant in a second. But that is the law. That is the conditional law that God made with the nation of Israel. The third important, now God made a lot more covenants than just these four. I'm just saying that these four are the basis upon which you can come back and really understand how the Bible flows foundationally. So the third one is the Davidic covenant, and that's the law that he makes with King David. And King David, not only does he make him king, but he also says that the Messiah is going to come through David's line. David was from the tribe of Judah, and the Christ was going to come from the line of Judah. That is the tribe. And so he tells David in what is it, 2 Samuel? In Samuel or Kings, I can't remember. Off the top of my head, I should have written that down. He tells him that the Messiah will come through you, and that it will be a king that will come through your kingly line, and it will save the world. It will be a Messiah that saves the world, that's prophesied to save the world. And this was, again, an unconditional covenant. So it was going to happen regardless of what David did, thank goodness, because David made a lot of mistakes. And, he did great things, but he also made a lot of mistakes. But it wasn't dependent on David doing anything in return. This was just what God said he was going to do. And then, so this is important for when Christ comes, because Christ had to come through the line of Judah. And so then we get to the fourth major covenant, which is the Messianic covenant, which says, I will send a Messiah that will be the Savior for all people. And this is how everyone in the world will have an opportunity to come to me through him. And so the reason that we had to have that he set up the Davidic covenant is because when you get to the Gospels and you start to see, like in the book of Matthew, for example, give the genealogy of Jesus Christ, he comes from the line of David. And Jesus Christ is the king, just the way that David was the king. And what's important is when you start to get into the history of the nation of Israel, then how it splits off, and 10 tribes go to the north and 2 tribes stay in the south. In the south's line of the monarchy, which started with Saul, then it goes to David. Well, actually, that's the whole nation of Israel. So you started with Saul, that was the first king. Then you go to King David, who is the second king. Then the third king was Solomon. Then Solomon's son is where the two nations split, where the nation splits into two, I should say. The 10 tribes at the north, and then the 2 tribes at the south. And the 2 tribes at the south were Judah and Benjamin. Once that happens, and that happens in the line of Samuel, and then it goes into Kings, where Kings talks about the kings of the north, which was the nation of Israel, and then the kings in the south, which was the nation of Judah. In the nation of Israel, they get a king that is not from David's line. So Solomon's son becomes the king of Judah. And then another king that is a part of Solomon's original council becomes the king of Israel. So Israel has kings that aren't even in the line of David whatsoever. But Judah, the southern kingdom of Israel, Judah, all come from the line of David. So the way that the kings succeed each other in Judah is so-and-so is the son of so-and-so is the son of so-and-so, all the way until you get to Jesus Christ. In the north, you had a lot of evil kings, and you had evil kings in the south too. And just because they were in the line of David does not mean they were perfect. But in the north, you had people that would kill each other to become king, and then they would take over, and they were not related to one another. So the succession, that's one of the reasons why the nation of Israel collapses sooner than the nation of Judah. And so, but this is important because when Jesus Christ comes, his Davidic line is proved, because that is a prophecy, that is a covenant that God has made. So when the Messianic covenant is fulfilled, that's the period of time that we're in right now. So that's the 4 covenants that, as you're reading the Bible, if you can understand and remember those things, it helps you to understand where the writers of all of the Bible are coming from. That is where they're coming from. So those are the 4 covenants to remember. The next thing to remember when reading the Bible and studying it is that the Bible, you can look at the Bible in sections of theme sections. Now, understand that the Bible that we read in the Protestant church is a Christian Bible. It is the Protestant Bible. There is a Catholic Bible. There is a Jewish Bible. There is and these Bibles are the same Bibles with a few books that are added or that were included in canon of the Bible. And so when I say the Bible, I'm talking about the Protestant Bible that we would get, that most, well, I don't want to say most people have, but that the majority of people have. The Jewish Bible, which is the Tanakh, it is not in the same order necessarily as the books in the Protestant Bible. They're not grouped the same way. Now, the first 5 are, but then after that, they all put them in different order. That doesn't mean that they're different versions. They're just in different order. So this section that I'm telling you about really just helps you to understand when you read the books them individually, what you're dealing with when it comes to where you're at in the line of history and what the book was actually for. So let's talk about what these sections are. So you have in the Old Testament, you have the first 5 books of the Bible are also called the Torah, and they are the books of law. And that's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Genesis tells the story of the creation of the world through God, and then it gets to the Abrahamic covenant. Then it tells the story of Abraham's descendants, which eventually becomes oh my gosh, I just totally lost my train of thought. Oh my gosh. It eventually, Isaac's son. Oh my gosh. This is what happens when you don't write things down and you try to go off of your, oh my gosh, Joseph. Hello. So, see, we all have little brain, glitches now and then. So, the book of Genesis starts with the creation of the world, and then it goes down into when Joseph becomes the second in command of Egypt. From that point, the Hebrews, which what they were called, began multiplying in population numbers. And when at the end of Genesis, Joseph is the second in command of Egypt, and the Pharaoh really respects him and reveres him, and Joseph ends up saving the Hebrew nation from drought and from dying off of lack of hunger, because the things that he does saves everyone from dying of starvation. So 400 years later, we have a Pharaoh that is scared of the Hebrew nation because they have grown so large with the number of people. So eventually what they do is they forget that Joseph had the respect of the Pharaoh at the time, and he enslaves them. Then we have Moses entering the story, and Moses is the author of the book of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and most of Deuteronomy, but then also Joshua comes along and finishes the book of Deuteronomy, because the end of Deuteronomy is the death of Moses. And so Moses comes along and he rescues the nation of Israel, or the Hebrew people, not the nation of Israel yet, the Hebrew people from enslavement in Egypt. And so then in the middle part of Exodus is when the law of Moses is given. And then you have the book of Leviticus, which is priestly instructions on how to come to God and be holy. And then you have the book of Deuteronomy, or you have the book of Numbers. The book of Numbers is a really interesting book because it's a census book. It tells you from the very beginning how many Israelites there were, what tribes there were, how many people were in each tribe, where the tribes were located in terms of, like, if you ever think about, okay, they wandered in the wilderness. Did they just wander in random haphazard groups of people? No. If you read the book of Numbers, it tells you exactly, this was where the temple was located, or the tabernacle. This is where the tabernacle was located. This is where all the tribes were located around it. Every tribe had their own territory, their little geographic territory. And the book of Numbers tells you how many people were there, and who were the leaders in each of those tribes. So the tribes come from Jacob's sons. So Jacob had 12 sons, and Joseph was one of those sons. So all of these tribes were descendants of those sons. And just like Jacob's sons that did not get along with each other all the time, the law of Moses goes into not only how to treat him and how to be holy to come to God. And that there's a lot of laws and a lot of rules about how you do that. The book of law also tells the Israelites how to get along with one another, because you have to understand it wasn't just like 10 or 15 or 20 of them. There were like 2 million. 2 million. That's how many like had come out of Israel. There were so many. That's why they had to get put into slavery, because they were starting to scare the Pharaoh with the number of people that they had there and the power that they were going to exert. So you had all these people that had lived under slavery for 400 years. And you have to understand, they did not live as a nation of people before that. It's not like they existed with these laws in Abrahamic periods of time. They didn't. This all culminates into this one moment where then they become the nation of Israel and they become God's people through the covenant God gives to them. So you have, with the covenant, you have moral law, which is like the 10 Commandments. This is how to live a moral life. Then you have civil law, which is this is how y'all need to live with one another. Those are the types of laws that no longer apply to us anymore, because we're not the nation of Israel that lives in the desert in tents surrounded by with the tabernacle in the middle. So we have different laws, different civil laws that apply to us in every nation now. So imagine these are the laws of that particular nation, just like America has its own laws, and Mexico has its own laws, and Canada has its own laws. So imagine these were the civil laws for the nation of Israel. Then you have the spiritual laws, and the spiritual laws were focused on, in order to come into God's presence, which only priests could do, people just couldn't walk into church like they could now. God is holy. And so to have his presence on the earth and for us to be in his presence, there had to be a way through which they did that, because we people are sinners. And so God's presence came down. It talks about this in the book of Exodus. And he comes into the Ark of the Covenant, and then they build a very specific tabernacle with very specific instructions. There's a curtain that goes in front of it. It has to be a certain number of inches deep. It has to be certain colors. Like there's very specific instructions that God gives them to carry. And the tabernacle at this point is just a tent. It's not a building, but there is still specific instructions. And in order for the priest to come into the presence of God, there had to be certain things, certain rules that they had to do. And part of that was atoning for their sins and making themselves holy to be into God's presence. So they had to atone for their sins, they had to sacrifice for their sins, and they had to come into God's presence. And this is the law that Jesus, as the Messiah, fulfills in the New Testament. So the books of law, and then you have, the books of Numbers tell you how many people they had. Deuteronomy shows God, along with promising them that there's a nation of Israel, he says, I'm going to make you my people, and I'm also going to give you a land in which to stay. And that land was Canaan. And he said, I'm going to give you Canaan. This is what you have to do to go take this land. And so in the book of Deuteronomy, all 12 tribes go into the land of Canaan because they're going to go scout out how they're going to do this. And God says, whatever, and remember when he made the covenant with them, it was conditional on, if you do what I say, if you follow my law, I will make you successful in all of your pursuits. They forget this immediately, because that's just what people do. And so they go and they scout this land of Canaan, which is full of giants, and they say that they're grasshoppers compared to these giants. So 10 of the scouts that go out, one from each of the tribe, says there's no way we're going to be able to do this. They come back with this report and say, nope, this isn't going to happen. And Joshua, who is one of the scouts that comes back and says, yes, we can do this. God says we can do this. And they get so angry at him And then Moses comes to his defense and says, yes, God said we can do this. Why are we not going to go do this? So the Israelite nation, remember there's 2 million of them, get so mad that they almost stone Moses and Joshua to death, because they're basically saying, y'all need to go out there and have some courage and do what God says. And God said he will make us successful. So Joshua came back with the faith. Joshua and Caleb came back with faith. This other 10 did not. And this is the reason why they wandered in the desert for 40 years, because they came back and immediately broke the covenant that they said that they would keep. And God said, if you do this, if you keep my covenant, I will make you successful. If you do not, this is what I will do. So God immediately is like, I mean, this just happened. Like, he just gave the law to Moses. Like, this is in the first year or 2 years or something. It's crazy. And then they immediately said they're not going to do it. So God says, well, we'll just start over again. And Moses comes to their defense and he says, please don't destroy my people. We can do this. Well, as punishment, he has the people wander in the wilderness for 40 years. And what he says is, all of the people from this generation that doubted that you could go and do what I said for you to do, none of them are going to enter the promised land, except for Joshua and Caleb. And then in the midst of that, Moses made his own mistakes and didn't follow God's plan either. And then God said, you're not going to see the promised land either. So Joshua and Caleb were the only two that got to go in and see the promised land. And Joshua ends up being Moses' successor. So they wander in the wilderness for 40 years. And Deuteronomy is the story of that 40 years period of time. Then, Exodus, and then these books of law is a story of the period of that 40 years. Then God says, okay, it's time to try again. So at the beginning of Deuteronomy, they take a new census, because the numbers was the census from the first time when they started 40 years before. Then Deuteronomy comes along and they take another census. And so they give you another group of these are all the men that are of this age that live in this nation. Because remember, God said, none of the people that are of this age right now are going to pass through to the promised land. So now we have a new generation of Israelites, and Joshua is going to eventually be their leader. So Deuteronomy is Moses's last. He goes to the people at the end of his life, and he reminds them of everything that they had promised God. And he reminds them of the covenant that they had made with God, and then gives them his last little speech. And then he passes the reins over to Joshua. So those first five books are the Torah. And these first five books are vitally important, obviously, especially to the Jewish nation even today, because they still hold all of that to be true and applicable in today's society. So then the next section we have is history. And these are the books of Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther. So this is the history of the actual nation of Israel. So when Joshua comes along, he's the successor of Moses. So Joshua does lead them into Canaan. Then we have the book of Judges, which is where they basically have nobody that's in leadership of them, and they just go into lawlessness. And it's a very interesting book if you ever read all the way through. We have Samson as one of the judges, and Samson is portrayed as a hero. Samson really is not a hero. He's kind of a womanizer, and he has a lot of sexual sin. And anyway, so read the book of Judges. And then Ruth is during that period of time. Then you have 1st and 2nd Samuel, which is the story of how the nation of Israel became a monarchy, and they got a king, which God did not want them to have, but they begged for it anyways, and so they got it, and now we look where we are. So it's the story of the nation of Israel. Then it's also the story of the fall of the nation of Israel, because in the books of 2nd Kings, what happens is the nation of Israel splits into two, and then we find out that the nation of Israel, the top 10 kingdoms that split away from the bottom 2 kingdoms, end up getting overtaken by Syria. Then you have the bottom of the nation, which is the tribes of Judah and Benjamin. They are sent into exile by Babylon. And you have the story of Nebuchadnezzar and Daniel and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. That's all towards the end. And then Malachi is the very last part before God goes silent for 400 years. Then you have Jesus Christ that rises up, and that's the end of the book of history. In the middle of that, you have the books of poetry, which are Job, Psalm, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, and Song of Solomon. These are books that are all written, the tone and the writing style of these books are allegorical and poetic. So if you read the book of Job, for example, it's almost like you're reading like a play. Like you could actually read it and think, I could see this as a play, where three friends are talking to to Job and all that stuff. So it's the writing style and is why those are named the book of poetry. Now, Psalms is mostly written by David, and there's a lot of songs that he sang because he was a musician, and they were written down, and that goes into the book of Psalms. Proverbs was written by a bunch of different people over a period of time. And then Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon were both written by Solomon, and Solomon was a fantastic writer. He was a very, very philosophical thinker, I guess, if you want to think about it that way. So he wrote those two books, and it's very poetic in the way that it was written. The styles are different than the other ones are. Then you have the prophets, and you have both the major and the minor prophets. And the prophets are Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, which is the writing of Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, Hosea, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, and Malachi. The major prophets are Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, and then and Daniel, and then the minor prophets are all the rest. And the reason that they're called major prophets is because they prophesied over a longer period of time, and their books are longer generally because they might have prophesied through several different kings. Now, these prophets, their stories existed interfolded into the books of history. So we had our first prophet in the book of 1 Samuel, and then we had prophets all the way through to the end of Esther. So it's really interesting. I'll put up a thing about how I did a whole timeline of the Bible, and I'll put it here as a supplemental thing so that you can see where the prophets, did they prophet to kings that were in the northern kingdom of Israel or the southern kingdom of Judah, and how many kings did they prophesy to? And so these prophets were not always welcome. They didn't always say things that people liked, obviously, but there's a lot of either they were prophesying about the immediate future of the nation that they were in, or in Isaiah's case, he was prophesying a lot about the coming Messiah, which would happen later. So these prophets were really important. And then at the end of Malachi, we have a period of 400 years where God did not speak to the nation of Israel at all. We had a lot of false prophets that happened during that time. But this period between the Old Testament and the New Testament is called the intertestamental period. And at the end of Malachi, when you get to the end of the Old Testament and the beginning of Matthew, there's a 400-year period where God didn't speak to anyone. And I don't know why we don't talk about this, because this is important. Have you ever wondered where oh my gosh, at Christmas, the Jewish holiday in Christmas, Hanukkah. Oh my gosh, I'm having brain farts this morning. The Hanukkah happens during this period of time. So during this period of time, you had the Maccabees, who were a Jewish family, and they go through a period where at the end they are exiled. At the end of Malachi, they are coming back together to they are allowed to come back into Jerusalem, and they're allowed to rebuild the temple, which was destroyed. That was another thing that I missed. So back in the book of the books of law, we have the tabernacle that I told you was a tent that they had while they were traveling in the wilderness. Then David comes along and says, God, you need more than a tent. You need an actual building. So I want to build you a building. God said, no, but I'm going to let Solomon, your son, do it. And so Solomon builds the temple. He builds the first temple, and God gives him instructions, very specific instructions about how to do this. And it's almost exactly like the tabernacle. It has the same dimensions. It has the same purple curtain. We call them curtains, but they're much thicker than curtains. And it's the same rule. We're still under the law of Moses. So at this point, not everyone can come into the tabernacle or to the temple to be in God's presence. And so during the time when the southern kingdom was destroyed, the Jerusalem was always the capital city of Judah, no matter what. The temple was destroyed, and then they rebuilt it. And then so now when Jesus Christ times comes along, we are in the second temple of building. So when Jesus Christ dies and the temple, the curtains of the temple are ripped, that is the second temple. And so during this time, they're under first Babylonian rule, then they're under Roman rule. Eventually they'll be under Roman rule. The Maccabees, the Israelites are constantly trying to get out of being ruled over by other people's kings. And so the Maccabees actually start a revolution and a revolt, and they win temporarily. During this time is when you hear the story of the oil lasting for 8 days. That is where Hanukkah comes from. I don't know why we don't talk about this in the Christian church. We should, because it gives people an understanding of like, okay, well, how did that story come along? And it's a very important story because the Maccabean revolt, there is actually, I remember at the beginning of this, I told you that there were different versions of the Bible. Well, there is a book of Maccabees, just like we have a book of Isaiah. There is a Maccabean book that tells us history of the Maccabean family. And the reason it's not in canon of the Bible is because it's not that it's not historical. It's just they don't believe that it's breathed from God. And so like the miracle of the oil lasting for 8 days, it just wasn't verified by biblical scholars. So it's not actually in the book of the Bible. But when Jesus Christ comes, they remember that this Maccabean revolt happened. And this was not only a political revolt, but also a physical revolt that was led by armies that wanted to overthrow the government's rule over them. So when Jesus Christ comes along, that's why a lot of people thought that he was going to be similar to the Maccabees, that he was going to be similar to that. And then they were disappointed when they figured out he was not going to be that kind of, this revolution was not going to be like that. So that's the book of prophets. Then you get into the New Testament, and the next section into that is you have the Gospels, which are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. These are the life of Jesus and the teachings of Jesus. So basically, big G, gospel, is the good news of Christ. Little g, Gospels, are the books themselves, if that helps you to understand that. Then you have the Christian, so you have the book of history in the New Testament, which is the history of the Christian church. That is the book of Acts. Luke wrote both the book of Luke, the Gospel of Luke, and also the book of Acts. And the Acts starts with Jesus Christ coming down after he was resurrected. He spends time with the apostles, then he goes up into heaven. Then God sends the Holy Spirit in Acts 2, which is the first Pentecost. Then from that point on, we go into Peter's ministry, Stephen's ministry, which Stephen is an early apostle of Jesus Christ. He gets stoned, and one of the people that made that decision was Paul. Actually, it was Saul. And Saul was a Jewish Pharisee. And Pharisees were very by the book. They understood the New Testament. We call it the New Testament. It was scriptures at the time. So we call it the Old Testament. When I'm saying the Old Testament, when I talk about these people in the Bible, understand that they would not have called it the Old Testament. They would have called it the scripture. But he was a Jew. He understood Jewish culture. He understood Jewish history. He studied under a rabbi. And so the book of Acts tells the story of not just the Christian church, but also of Paul and his conversion. And so he was one of the instrumental people that decided to kill and stone Stephen. He gets on the road to Damascus. Jesus appears to him and changes him completely, and then he becomes Paul, and then becomes the most prominent Christian throughout history and the most instrumental in spreading Christianity throughout the world. I personally find Paul to be one of the most fascinating people to have ever lived, aside from Jesus Christ, obviously. But anyway, I digress. So you have the history of the church, and that starts with, like I said, Jesus visiting the apostles after he was resurrected, and it ends with Paul being put into house arrest in Rome. And so he's traveling to Rome, and that's where the book ends. And it's over a period of, I think, 37 years, I think. So we have, the end, we have Christ ascends around 30 AD, and then I think that Paul dies in 67 AD, if I'm not mistaken. Then you have the Pauline epistles. Epistles is just another word for letters. You have the Pauline epistles. These are all the letters that Paul wrote. So you have Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, and Philemon. Now, some of those he wrote to churches, and some of them he wrote to people, and specifically that were pastors at churches. And the way that they have them in the Bible is not chronological. So he wrote Galatians first, but we have Romans as the first letter that's in the Bible. But all of these correspond with the book of Acts. So if you're reading the Pauline epistles, you can correspond to them with events that happened in the book of Acts. And that's kind of how you determine like when he wrote each letter. Then you have the other letters that were written by people like James and John and Peter. And you have Hebrews next, which we don't really know who wrote Hebrews. It was probably a lot of people. Some, maybe Paul had an influence in it. And then you have James, which James wrote. 1st and 2nd Peter, which Peter wrote. 1st and 2nd, 3rd John, which John wrote, and then Jude, which Jude wrote. And then Revelation is the book of prophecy, which John wrote and saw based on what he saw when he was in exile. So those are the sections of the book. So as you're reading the Bible, it's always nice to know, where are we at with the covenant that we're in, and what part of time and what section are we in, which helps give you the kind of some perspective and context. So now let's talk about, this is going to be a long video, but that's okay because you can watch it in different sections. I'll put the bookmarks or whatever. So then let's talk about something that nobody ever really talks about, which is Bible translations. I am not a translation absolutist or fundamentalist. Like, I don't believe that one translation is better than another. Like, you have to read like King James Version or something like that. I'm looking at this, and I'll post this on as I'm talking about this. But you have a spectrum, if you want to think about it as a spectrum. So on this side, you have word for word translations. This is going to be where your King James Version comes in. The word for word translation is going to be, so understand, when you have translations of the Bible, the very first, anything that was written in the Old Testament was written in Hebrew by Hebrews to other Hebrews. They were not concerned with the rest of the world knowing what they had to say. So they wrote it in Hebrews. Now, only Hebrews knew Hebrew. So if they would go to, I don't know, Rome, nobody in Rome would know Hebrew. So that's important. During the intertestamental period, they had influence from Greece. And this period of time was called the Hellenistic period. And Alexander the Great had this idea he was going to conquer the whole world, and everyone was going to have Greek culture, and it was going to be Greek philosophy and Greek verbs, or Greek language, and everything was going to be Greek. So at that point in time, the nation of Israel, or the nation of Judah, with influences from this period of time, translated their writings of scripture from Hebrew to Greek. So we still have the Hebrew translation. We still have the original Hebrew texts. But we also have the Greek text. And this is called the Septuagint. So the Greek translation of the Hebrew version is the Septuagint. And that is what Jesus and all the disciples in the New Testament were speaking from, was from the Greek translation. Okay, so that's your first types of translation, your Bible translation. So when you have word for word, then when it gets transferred from original Hebrew into other languages, you have ones that stick with exactly what the words meant, and they try to translate it as close to the word its meaning itself. That's going to be your New American Standard Bible, your English Standard Version, your King James Version, I'll post all the different versions. Then on the other side of the spectrum, so you have word for word. Then on the other side of the spectrum, you have thought for thought. And these are the Bibles that try to translate the idea. It's not like it's different in terms of like, well, some of them are different, but like it's trying to translate to users that are just lay people and are not pastors or haven't gone to seminary. What is the idea behind the verses? So these are going to be your New International Version, your Contemporary English Version, New Living Translation, things like that. So some people really prefer the King James Version. If you are going to going to be in the mission in the ministry, or if you're going to seminary, or if you're studying it like for real Bible scholarship, like these are the translations of the word for word are going to be really good if you already have a good foundational understanding of the Bible, or if you just really like knowing verbatim what the original one said. The other types of versions are going to be really good for people that are new Christians, new believers, that are trying to understand the ideas behind them. I will say that I like the thought for thought versions until I started studying more about the Bible. Now I have different types of versions. I have different translations. So I have King James. Actually, I have the logos.com, and the Bible app will do the same thing, but it'll give you the translation of a different verse in various different types of translations. When we read the Bible in Sunday school class, sometimes I'll ask people to read different versions of it to see what the different types of words are used. So these are the different types of Bibles that you can have. Now, some of these translations, you can go into more detail if you want. Some of these translations borderline on heresy. Like if you go really much into some of these New Age Bibles, they'll translate things that are not actual true. So, I would stick to the things that are on the spectrum, just with the understanding of knowing that if you get a thought for thought version, it's not going to be word for word. The King James Version is going to sound different because it's going to have different types of words in there. But if you're trying to understand meaning, then these kind of help you with that. So that's how to read for the Bible translations. So the next thing that I'll say is when you're reading the Bible, I'm trying to get people to, if you can read a whole book in one sitting, if you have not read any of the Bible at all, if you've only read a couple of books and you're trying to read the whole thing, try as best as you can to read the book in one sitting. And there's a lot of books you can do this for. Not every book is very long. Some of these books are long. Some of them really aren't. And the goal is not to understand what you just read. The goal is to get an overall idea of what that book of the Bible is actually about. And you're trying to understand, if possible, number one, who wrote that book? Who is the author of that book? Pretty much every every single book of the Bible has a known writer. There's only like the book of Proverbs has a bunch of different writers, and it's not necessarily important to know who wrote them because they're just ideas that are just universal ideas. The Proverbs are just universal ideas. They're not specific to any one period of time. They're ideas and thoughts that are good to have all the time. So we know that that's just a group of writers. But the book of Proverbs, as an example, does have a very specific purpose. It's small tidbits of information that help you live a really good life. And there's people that have just said really profound things. And so the Bible scholars wrote them down. And so the next thing that you want to know is, okay, so who wrote it? What is the purpose of that book? What is the author's point of trying to convey it? Is the person that wrote this down trying to give you a historical timeline? Are they trying to tell a very specific story? Like Nehemiah and Ezra are telling the very specific story of how they rebuilt the Second Temple. The book of Esther told a very specific story that happened in a very specific family at a very specific time in history. The book of 1st and 2nd Samuel is the story of the first king, second king, and third king of Israel. And then 1st and 2nd Kings is a very wide, just historical timeline of who all the kings were, were they a good or bad king, what are some of the highlights of things that they did, and then how did they die, and then how are they succeeded. It's literally the story of all the kings. So each book has its own purpose. It also has its own audience. So let's say that the Torah, the original audience was for other Hebrews in the nation of Israel. Everything that was written in the Old Testament was written with the idea that the people reading it would be the Hebrew nation. So they would understand the history. So if I were somebody that were, under the rule of David, I would have known, because I'm the original, I'm a Hebrew, I would have known the Torah. That was given. So all the Hebrews at that time were all on the same page when it came to the law. And they were also on the same page when it came to a shared history. But then you get into the New Testament, and you take the Pauline epistles, for example. Paul was writing to very specific congregations in very specific time periods for very specific reasons. These are important because you need to understand, like, when Paul wrote the letter, was he writing to a mostly Jewish audience? Was he writing to a mostly Gentile audience? What city was this church nestled in, and what were some of the challenges that these different geographical areas had? If you wanted to think about this way, if I'm a church leader and I'm writing a letter to churches throughout the nation, throughout the United States, would the letter I write to Portland, Oregon be the same as the letter I would write to Florida, to like a Miami, Florida? No, because each of those congregations are vastly different. And each of those geographical locations are struggling with vastly different problems. Same thing as, like, if I'd write it to Dallas, Texas, and then if I wrote one to Los Angeles, California, if I wrote one to New York City, all those letters would be different. I would be focusing on different things, because if I'm giving them advice, the people in Portland do not have the same struggles as the people in New York City, that don't have the same struggles in Miami, Florida, that don't have the same struggles in Ontario, Canada, or any of these, even in Mexico, some of these other places. It's the same as if I'm writing a letter to the nation of China. Would that be at all the same thing as something would it be the same struggles whatsoever as the people in Plano, Texas? Absolutely not. So if you look at who the audience was and what the purpose of that letter was, it helps you to understand the context. I think we miss this part a lot whenever we're studying the Bible. So when you read the Bible in especially the letters from Paul, you need to read in one sitting, because if you get a letter from a friend, do you start in the middle and do you only read one paragraph? No, you read the whole letter at once. And then you can go back and read it more than once. But you read the whole letter once first all the way through. Look at Paul's letters the exact same way. So read the whole thing all the way through once, because you're just trying to understand tone, who wrote it, why, what are the major events that happen within this particular book? What period of time did it happen in? These are all important. The goal is not to read it to try to get an epiphany from God the first time that you read a book. That's not the goal of Bible study. The goal of Bible study is to understand the Bible. And so to understand the epiphanies will come. Trust me. God has shown me so many things just by trying to understand the Bible and what the writers were actually saying, and the historical significance of the Bible. So you'll get that. It's just, sometimes I think that we read the Bible and expect to have these deep emotional epiphanies every single time that we read the Bible. And if we don't, we feel like we're not close to God. And that is such a fallacy. That's not the goal. But that's what I would suggest, is to try to read all the books in one sitting first, all the way through. Don't stop. Even if it's the book of Numbers, you don't have to stop and study the Numbers the first time you read the book of Numbers. Just read it. Just read the whole book. A lot of it's not going to make sense to you because you don't understand what it's even saying, but at least you'll know, okay, well, this is clearly God telling me how many people are in each of the Israel tribes, and you'll get it. Just read it first all the way through. So that would be my next suggestion. The last thing that I would say that's foundationally important to understand about the Bible is that the nation of Israel was comprised of 12 tribes, because it was based on the sons of Jacob. But Joseph, his sons, because Joseph was sold into slavery, his sons, the two sons, get his inheritance. And then the Levites that came from Levi do not get a geographical area, because they become the Levitical priests. They become the priestly line that doesn't have a geographic location. They minister to everyone throughout the whole nation. So the Levitical, the priestly line, there's very specific ways that God tells the other nations to provide for that priestly line. So when the two nations split, the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom, people from the tribe of Levi go with both of them, go with all of them, because they're dispersed amongst all of the tribes. But if you can understand the tribes, it helps you to understand, because there's a lot of times that if you go through and you study the Bible, it'll say so-and-so from the tribe of Benjamin, so-and-so from, like Paul, it actually says in the book of Acts, he is from the tribe of Benjamin. Jesus from the tribe of Judah. Genealogy was very, very important to, and it still is very important to the Jewish people. It should be important to us too. And I think that sometimes we think that it's too complicated, but I will tell you, I can talk to people about Game of Thrones and they can tell me the genealogy of fake kings that never even, like, people, I could talk to people about Lord of the Rings. They could tell me about Middle Earth. They could tell me about the elves. They could tell me about, like, the hobbits and who is, what their job was and who was related to who and blah, blah, blah. But then people say the Bible is too hard to understand when it comes to genealogy. No, it's not. It's actually very easy once you understand that who the actual audience was for and why you should care about where they came from. So like Matthew, for an example, if you go through one of the ways that people say that the Bible isn't true or it contradicts itself, if you read the genealogy of Jesus Christ in Matthew, then you read the genealogy of Jesus Christ in Luke, you would think, well, those are two completely different genealogies. And a Christian that hasn't studied it would say, well, those are just the people that were important at the time. No, one of them is a genealogy of Mary, and one of them is a genealogy of Joseph. And one of them has women in the genealogy, which the other one does not. But it's important to understand that when Matthew was speaking to a largely Jewish audience who would have known who all these people are. So to the audience he was writing for, they understood every single person that was here and why he mentioned them. Luke was speaking to the Gentiles. So this is why context of the Bible is important, because when you have conversations with people and even other Christians, when you know these things, it helps you to give other people context that they might not have otherwise. So, lastly, I wanted to tell you this, and I'll show you which, this is going to really help you. I found this poor little Bible that is falling apart. I don't even have, the first little area has completely fallen out. I need a new Bible. But what do they say? A person's life, what is it? If you find a person whose Bible fallen apart, you'll find a person whose life isn't, or something like that. But anyways, so this is the Life Application Study Bible, and it comes in different translations. This was given to me as a gift, and it's the best thing that I ever got in my whole life, because this Bible starts off, and this is Zechariah. Every single time that it starts, it tells you the vital statistics of this book. What is the purpose? Who was the author? When was it written? Who was the original audience? What is the setting, the historical setting that it's in? What is the key verse from that book? What is the key place, key people in it, and then special features, and then it gives a summary of that particular book. Then at the top, it gives a timeline of all the things that happen in this book from start to finish and kind of what's going on. The other thing that it does, which I really appreciate, is it gives, I'll go to Acts because this is really helpful. It gives maps. In this case, I'm turning to Paul's mission journey. So it always gives me maps in every single book about where this is taking place, what part of time period of history are we in. These are the maps of Paul's missionary journeys. You have the first missionary journey, which happens, it tells you between Acts 13 and Acts 14:28. Second missionary journey is Acts 15 through Acts 18. Third is Acts 18 through Acts 21. And then you have the journey to Rome where he is under house arrest, which is Acts 21 to the end of Acts 28. But it shows you exactly the paths that he took. He goes here, here, here. So here's Galatia. Here is Colossae. Here's Athens. Here's Greece. Like, here's all this stuff. So it gives you context of like, oh, this is where he traveled, this is where he went, which is really, really helpful. So get a study Bible if possible, because it gives you so much context. The other thing that this particular study Bible does, and a lot of Bibles do this, but this one when I started understanding, I heard it said this way: the Bible is hyperlinked. Okay, so the Bible, if you look at right here, you have these little verses that it's referring to. So I'm in Acts, and it's giving me like Ephesians 6:18 or Daniel 3:28. What it's saying is this verse somehow has to do with this verse. So if I turn it back to that verse, I'll find something that is either being referenced here or a historical thing that referenced. This is really helpful when you have things like in Ruth, at the end of the book of Ruth, she makes a mention of people took off their shoes and went to the gate or something like that. Well, this was a law, that part of the civil law of the nation of Israel. And it links that particular law so that I can go back and read when God said that they were supposed to do that, which is really, really cool. Then, if you go and read the Pauline letters, the Pauline epistles, letters that Paul wrote, I love it because it tells you, so like this is Galatians, and this letter is from Paul, an apostle, is not appointed by any group of people, blah, 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 Acts 20:24. So it's referencing something that happened in Acts 20:24. So if I go back and read that, either it's where Paul was at the time, or when he wrote that, or some kind of reference to that. So that's really important to understand too. So get yourself a good study Bible. This is a good one. I really, really like this one. It gives you also tons of, this Bible is huge. It gives you tons of notes at the bottom that give you reference points that kind of tell you like more involved about like what that story is referring to, or there's all kinds of great things. Then it also gives you a blueprint of each book, which I think is cool. It like tells you like the different sections and like what that particular blueprint of that particular book is. So that's one thing that you could do. The other way to study the Bible is chronologically. And a lot of people find this to be very valuable, but you will need a chronological study Bible to do it, because unless you're going to go through and study all, I'm getting to the point where I can put things in order once they happen without having to check one of these, but you do need this to start. And this one is called the Chronological Study Bible. It gives things in epochs, E-P-O-C-K. I mean, E-P-O-C-H's. And what it does is it has divided it out in like, Jurassic period, like those kind of the periods of time in like dinosaur history were epochs. So, but they do that with the Bible. And so they're like the kingly epic, where all it does is this is the epic of all the different things that happen with this particular time period in history. So I really like that. And then this also gives a lot of references to historical things that are happening outside of the nation of Israel, which gets really interesting whenever you get into the New Testament, because then it starts to talk about when Paul goes and preaches in Athens, what happened after Paul went to go preach in Athens from a historical perspective that's not in the Bible, but is definitely recorded in different parts of history. So with that said, I wanted to end this very long video, with how some highlights that I got from it. Talks about reading theological history. So the book, the Bible is a theological history of the God of the nation of Israel and the God of Israel. So this is what it says. It says, while both the Old Testament and New Testaments present their message on a historical frame, the message takes precedence to the historical setting. The writers of biblical history did not write in the same manner as the modern historian. Ancient history writers were not as interested in when something happened as they were in the meaning of the events that they were recounting. Therefore, the reader of biblical history must be aware that many of the concerns that dominate modern history writing, as in specific dates, discussions of natural causes, etc., simply were not very important to most of the biblical writers. So the Old Testament is centered in history. It describes historical events and is addressed at one level at least to a specific historical audience, the Hebrew people. This makes the faith taught in the Bible very different from the beliefs of other ancient Near Eastern peoples. Israel understood God as a God who acts in history. And for this reason, almost every religious utterance was read in the light of the history of God's mighty acts. Therefore, to understand the Old Testament as it is meant to be understood, the writer must have some grasp of the historical events that lie behind each chapter and book. Unless the reader knows the history of Israel and the ancient Near East, the Bible will always, to some extent, be a closed book. So I hope that helps you have some type of foundational way to start reading the Bible on your own. It's really important that we as Christians, in my opinion, I think that Bible illiteracy is the number one problem in the Christian church. And until we start to understand this and really start to tackle it, we're not gonna be able to make much of an impact. It's one thing to know that Jesus Christ is the Messiah and he'll save you, but we have to know the Bible too. We have to know the history of the Bible. And I want people to read it for themselves. I don't want them to learn all of their Bible knowledge based on what other people are telling them and how to interpret it. It's just, I want people to be able to read themselves. What did Paul say? Or what did Jesus say? Hide your word in your hearts so that you might not sin against God. That's because we have to all understand the Bible ourselves and read it firsthand. I always say, you never know what could happen in the future. Someone could come along that destroys all the Bibles, and that would be really hard to do now with technology being as it is. But if you were no longer able to download any Bible apps, if they put a freeze on knowing how to access any websites that had Bible history, and the only thing we had left were just the Bibles we had, how much would you know right now? And so I think that's important. So treat the Bible like it might go away tomorrow, and you're just trying to understand as much as possible. And you will be shocked at how much people come into your life that God presents you with, that your knowledge, your specific knowledge that you're learning can come in handy. So I hope this helped you. Put in the comments if you have any questions or if there's anything that you want me to go into more depth about. And I certainly will do that anyways, but I would love to know what your thoughts are and if there's any other insights that you have. Bye.